My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are slouching to Gomorrah. Yeah, we're nearing the end of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. We're smack dab in the middle of the third section of the book on totalitarianism. Um, you know, Depending on where you read and what time you're reading it, some people will say this is the least important section, and some people will say it's the most important. Samuel Moyn, who's been a recent virulent critic of Arendt and a lot of her modern uses, has just written another piece saying, everybody's pointing towards the relevance of Arendt and turning towards part 3 of the book on totalitarianism, and it's the least important part of the book and the most problematic, and that we should stop reading it as a window onto the present. I think it's an important corrective and an important view. I've always, in writing and speaking about this section, warned against simply seeing it as a way of thinking about the present. First of all, it's not. It's written about the Nazi and Bolshevik movements. And secondly, Arendt is always alert to new things and differences and accounts. And it's important that we not simply try and take what she's written 70 years ago and apply it to the present. That said, and I mean that, and I'm going to be, I don't think we're in a totalitarian. I certainly don't think we have a totalitarian government. I think there are totalitarian elements of politics, and I think that's what her book is helpful in thinking through and hoping to understand. This particular chapter 11 on the totalitarian movements, has always been, to my mind, the most important chapter in the section on totalitarianism in thinking about our contemporary predicaments. It is so because it is an attempt to understand the totalitarian movement as opposed to totalitarianism in power, which will be chapter 12. That's not an advertisement to skip chapter 12 because it's less relevant. Chapter 12 is important in understanding totalitarianism, but this chapter on the totalitarian movement is absolutely essential in trying to understand how totalitarian movements operate before they come to power, right? As she says at the very beginning, how they operate under conditions of constitutional government and freedom of opinion, right? We have in the United States and in much of the world, constitutional governments that boast freedom of opinion to greater and lesser degrees. And in such governments and in such situations, totalitarian movements, when they struggle for power, are like other parties. They're not that different. That's because, as we'll read in chapter 12, the essence of totalitarianism is terror. And before they have power, totalitarian movements are limited in the amount of terror and the extent of terror they can use. They need to win adherents just like any other political party. They need to appear plausible in public and not yet rigorously isolated from all other sources of information. And so, to the extent totalitarianism may be a problem today, which I leave really as an open question because I don't have an answer to it. I'm not sure you can tell yet. It's not going to be able to make use of the essential aspects of totalitarianism, namely terror, in order to take power. And so this is the chapter where Arendt, more than anywhere else, sort of isolates how insurgent totalitarian movements go about trying to take power and then become totalitarian governments. Like I said, I don't think we're there. I'm not sure we'll ever get there again. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But if you want to understand the dangers and the techniques that totalitarian movements use, this is Arendt's attempt to analyze that. She separates in the beginning, and so the chapter is actually broken into two parts. The first part on propaganda, totalitarian propaganda, and the second part on totalitarian organization. And the key insight, and I think still underappreciated, I mean, the amount this chapter has been read and talked about ad infinitum, it seems. But while so many people focus on the section on propaganda, you get much less interest in the section on totalitarian organization. And her argument is that the core of propaganda is organization. Her argument is that the way totalitarian movements seek to appeal to the masses and to win adherents and thus to become powerful is not through the content of their propaganda. It's not through the claim that Aryans are a chosen race and Jews are a subhuman race. It's not through the claim that the bourgeoisie is corrupt and the proletariat will inherit the earth. She says, the ideology is important, but it's not original, and the content is not what matters. In the end, what's going to matter more than anything else is the organization, is the fact that the totalitarian movements organizes homeless, lonely, atomized people and gives them a sense of purpose and gives them a sense of meaning and insulates them from the real world of facts, insulates them from plurality, and makes them believe that they've created a coherent fictional reality in which they are meaningful and important and have a purpose. And that organization is what the people crave. They don't actually care about the racism. They don't really care about the classism of socialism. Classism and racism are simply ideological crutches that are used by totalitarian movements to give the people what they really want, which is belonging to a unity, belonging to a mass movement, belonging to something that gives them a sense of purpose. In the beginning of this chapter on totalitarian propaganda, Arendt distinguishes terror from propaganda. She says that when totalitarianism is in full control, when it's in power, it will replace propaganda with terror. She said that terror is the essence of totalitarian government, which she's going to talk a lot about in chapter 12 and also in the epilogue on ideology and terror. That terror, unlike propaganda, seeks full indoctrination, and it uses violence not to frighten people, but to realize and fully create a fictional, coherent, ideological world. This terror is only fully perfected or closely to fully perfected in something like a concentration camp, not even in Nazi Germany or Bolshevist Russia. There's always going to be exceptions to it and weaknesses in it. But she'll explore that more in chapter 12. This chapter, she says, is on propaganda. And we really need to understand what she means by totalitarian propaganda. And it's going to, as I said, spoiler alert, right? I've already given it. It's going to end in saying that the core of propaganda is actually organization. But the first thing to realize about propaganda is that it's aimed not at the mob, but at masses. Now, we talked last week about the masses versus the classes. And the key thing to remember is that while classes of people share common interests, masses are people who are from all the different classes who feel, in a sense, adrift or left out of the class they're in and drop out of it and become a kind of atomized mass. And as a result, the masses don't have interests, or if they do, their interests are not what drive them, as do classes. The masses, she says, are attracted to the unpredictable and absolute. Thus, they're anti-utilitarian in their interests, and they're willing to sacrifice comfort and security for meaning. I mean, that's the key aspect of the masses. They care so much about finding something purposeful or meaning that they're even willing to sacrifice their individual interests to have that meaning. And this aspect of the masses means that what they really want is an absolute guarantee. They want to know, in a world of insecurity and conflict and plurality, they want to know the truth. They want to know something foundational. And this is the connection between science and propaganda in totalitarian movements. In totalitarianism, the reason behind the propaganda doesn't appeal to rational interest. It's the claim that there's an absolute sense of meaning in the world. And thus interest is a collective force can only be felt, she says, when there are stable social bodies. The masses, however, don't belong to any social or political body. And so she says on page 348, the fanaticism of members of totalitarian movements is produced by the lack of self-interest of masses who are quite prepared to sacrifice themselves. I mean, this is one of the really important and fascinating aspects of totalitarian movements, is that many of the people who are the most gung-ho supporters of totalitarian movements, you look at them and say, why are they doing this? It's not in their interests. It's not pursuing their interests. And what she's saying is their interest is not a rational social interest. It's not an economic interest. It's not a political interest. But it does have an interest, but the interest is in being part of a movement. And so she'll continue on 348 and say, totalitarian movements use socialism and racism by emptying them of their utilitarian content, the interests of class or nation. Again, it's not the content of racism or the content of socialism that totalitarian movements depend on. They are the ideology that the movement is able to choose because it works. And what the people in the masses care about more than the content is the certainty and the comfort that comes with a coherent fiction, an ideology that claims to explain the whole world. So they care more for the form of scientific prophecy and absolute certainty than for the content. And so totalitarianism is about, or works by, making predictions and then making the predictions come true. That only can really happen once totalitarianism is in power, because when it's in power, you can predict things. You can say, I'm going to make the Moscow subway the best in the world, and then you can actually do it. Or you can say, we're going to eliminate unemployment, and you can eliminate unemployment benefits and say there is no unemployment, and anyone who's unemployed and can't eat will die, and it goes away. And so in power, you can actually bring your predictions to truth. But before you get power, when you're part of a totalitarian movement, the totalitarian leader has to somehow convince people of their unending infallibility. This is on page 349. They can never admit an error. So on 349, she says, the mass leaders in power have one concern: to make their predictions come true. And before they're in power, they just have to never admit an error and somehow make it seem as if their predictions are always about to come true. She continues, the propaganda effect of infallibility The striking success of posing as a mere interpreting agent of predictable forces has encouraged in totalitarian dictators the habit of announcing their political intentions in the form of prophecy. On 350, she writes, the language of prophetic scientificality corresponded to the needs of the masses who had lost their home in the world and now were prepared to be reintegrated into the eternal, all-dominating forces which by themselves would bear man, the swimmer on the waves of adversity, to the shores of safety. So just to understand the basic argument here, totalitarianism, before it comes into power, has to appeal to the masses. The masses are homeless, purposeless. They feel a need for meaning. They desire to escape a reality that is uncomfortable, complicated, dark. And so there's a, quote, longing of the masses for a completely consistent, comprehensible, and predictable world. And this is now the key, I think, the key move, right? On page 350 to 351, bottom of 350 to top of 351. She says, for the masses, in contrast to classes, want victory and success as such in their most abstract form. They care about victory. They don't care about the bourgeoisie or the working class. They don't care about the Aryans or the Jews. What they care about is winning. Why? Because when you win, you're part of something and you get meaning and purpose. So she continues, more important than the cause that may be victorious or the particular enterprise that may be a success is the victory no matter what cause and success no matter what enterprise, right? On 351 to 352, she says, what convinces the masses are not facts and not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system of which they are presumably a part. It's consistency, it's victory, it's success that brings people together from their loneliness and their purposelessness and makes them feel like they're winning. I mean, we're winning, right? That's the claim of the proto-totalitarian leader who's not yet totalitarian, but wants to be. They are predisposed, she says, to all ideologies because they explain facts as mere examples of laws and eliminate coincidences by inventing an all-embracing omnipotence, which is supposed to be at the root of every accident. She says that totalitarian propaganda thrives on this escape from reality into fiction, from coincidence into consistency. And on 352, she says the masses' escape from reality is a verdict against the world in which they are forced to live and which they cannot exist, since coincidence has become its supreme master and human beings need the constant transformation of chaotic and accidental conditions into a man-made pattern of relative consistency. The world is complicated. It doesn't make sense. It is unpredictable. It's hard to control. And when you are not in a class, when you've exited a class and your interests are not doing it for you, and you are feeling adrift, consistency, coherence, success, victory, winning, that's what gives you a sense of purpose. And she says, before they seize power and establish a world according to their doctrines, this is on 353, before they get there, before they have power, totalitarian movements conjure up a lying world of consistency. It's one of my, I don't know, it's one of my favorite phrases. If you read my book, Perils of Invention, you'll see that this is a big part of what I'm interested in. But they conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself. For many of us, for those of us who are outside of stable worlds and stable political bodies, a lying world of consistency is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than to reality itself. And thus, the lying world of consistency, she says, is achieved by victory, by being a part of a movement. And the masses accept this not because they're stupid or wicked, she says on 352, but because in the general disaster of the inconsistency and incoherence of this world, this escape from reality grants them a minimum of self-respect. And that's the sort of insight of the totalitarian movement, that people will prefer self-respect that's based in a lying world of consistency over facts and truth and incoherence. The last part of this section is about how anti-Semitism for the Nazis and anti-bourgeois sentiment for the Bolsheviks became part of the self-definition of Nazism and Bolshevism. And the point is that Nazi propaganda, to use the one example, was ingenious enough to transform anti-Semitism into a principle of self-definition. As Nazis, we are anti-Semites. And thus to eliminate from anti-Semitism, fluctuations of mere opinion. It's not an option. That's who we are. We're anti-Semites. And it uses this persuasion, she says, to give these atomized, undefinable, unstable, feudal masses a means of self-identification and definition. Why does it do that? And here's the transition in the chapter. Because in doing that, it makes them better candidates for organization, right? On 350, that's on 356. And at the bottom of 356 on to 357, she says that what propaganda really does is it allows the movement to, quote, set itself up as the artificial extension of the mass meeting, the big meeting where people get together and scream and yell together. And it rationalized the essentially feudal feelings of self-importance and hysterical security that the mass meeting offers to isolated individuals and atomized society. What you're trying to do is take these people who are alone and give them that feeling of being part of a unity, part of a mass. And the reason you do that is that the true goal of totalitarian propaganda is not persuasion, but organization. That's on 360. The true goal of totalitarian propaganda is not persuasion, but organization. Well, I'll say it slightly differently. Organization becomes a means of persuasion. You persuade people by organizing them into a unity or a mass unity that makes them feel like they're winning and therefore important, and that persuades them to be part of the movement. The accumulation of power, she continues, without the possession of the means of violence is done through this organization. And you don't need original ideological content. What you need is what she calls, quote, on 361, the power of a living organization. It's this power of being organized that is what contributes to the persuasiveness of totalitarian movements. The second part of the chapter is on totalitarian organization. How does it happen? And she says that while the content, racism, classism, is not new, right? The ideologies are not really new. What's new is the forms of organization that totalitarian movements employ. And they're designed, she says, to build a society whose members act and react according to the rules of a fictional world. There are, she doesn't make these 100% clear in this section, but I think you can identify four forms of totalitarian organization that she discusses. The first, and by far the most important, is the front organization of sympathizers. The second is the principle of duplication. The third is the leader principle. And the fourth are what she'll call elite formations of the movement, which are separated from ordinary members. So those are the four forms of organization that organize an amorphous mass of itemized and isolated and lonely people into a unity that can win and have success, and therefore persuades people to become part of the movement. Thus, it's not that propaganda and terror are two sides of the same coin. They're not, because terror is when is when totalitarianism is in power. But organization and propaganda, she says on 364, are two sides of the same coin. Organization is the most important aspect of propaganda. So of these four types, these four forms of organization, the most important, I said before, is the front organization. She calls it a protective wall that organizes fellow travelers into front organizations. Basically, what you do is you have the true believers around the leader in the middle, but you create front organizations, sympathizers, and people who are sympathetic to the totalitarian movement, but not full believers in it. But because they're sympathetic enough to it, they largely accept much of what they say, and they, in a sense, form a buffer or a wall that protects the members from the facts and opinions that are part of the real world outside of the totalitarian organization. So that the members, the true members, are never actually confronted with the outside world on 367. The true members thus live in a fully fictional and closely cordoned off world of the party, Bolshevik party, the Nazi party. The structure of totalitarian organization, therefore, is ever narrowing circles of unreality, each protected by the real world, by the one further out. So the idea is you create all these different levels of organizations, front organizations, such that the truest believers are protected by the true believers, who are protected by the maybe believers, who are protected by the fellow travelers. And the result on 367, she writes, is that the fellow travelers organizations surround the totalitarian movements with a mist of normality and respectability that fools the membership about the character of the outside world as much as it does the outside world about the true character of the movement. Both sides are fooled, right? Because they're confronted by these buffer of front organizations. The front organization functions both ways, as the facade of the totalitarian movement to the non-totalitarian world, and as the facade of this world to the inner hierarchy of the movement. But the key, on 367, she writes, the key is to prevent members of the movement from ever being directly confronted with the outside world. It's to make these members so completely insulated from reality of the non-totalitarian world that they constantly underestimate their own power and the risks of totalitarian politics. They don't see how dangerous it can be. The second form of organization, totalitarian organization, that she talks about is duplication. The point is that these front organization patterns are repeated on many different levels, so that as you get increasingly inside the party, there's increasing complete disassociation from the real world. And so she talks about how with the Nazi party, first you had the party, then in 1922, the party formed the SA, which was a more militant organization than the party itself. In 1926, they created the SS, which was the elite formation of the SA. In 1929, the SS was separated from the SA under Himmler. Then, when that wasn't radical enough, they created the Waffen-SS as an even more elite formation. And when that wasn't enough, they created something called the Verfügungstruppe, which I don't quite know what it's called in English, but is another level of SS hierarchy. The point is you have so many hierarchies, so many duplicate organizations, and that this same strategy, she says, was used in professional organizations. So you would have a teachers union, but then you'd have teachers union of the Nazi party. And then you'd have the teachers union of the Nazi party who are sort of the more, intense members, the leadership. And then you could even create fake departments of government, a fake State Department, a fake Department of Immigration. And all of this, she says, works to undermine the status quo. It's all designed to separate party members from reality and to make them so that they could not get used to and take root in the ordinary world. On 369, she says that what we create here is a fluctuating hierarchy with its constant addition of new layers and shifts in authority. On 371, she'll add, the technique of duplication, certainly useless for the direct overthrow of government, proved extremely fruitful in the work of undermining actively existing institutions and in the decomposition of the status quo, which totalitarian organizations invariably prefer to an open show of force. You don't try and openly force an overthrow of the government. You undermine the status quo. You create buffer zones, so you create a whole elite that's isolated from the real world, and that's how you begin to undermine the status quo. The third organizational form she talks about is the leader principle. The leader, she says, is in the center of the movement. As the motor that swings it into motion sits the leader. This is on 373. The leader is separated from the elite formation by an inner circle of the initiated who spread around him an aura of impenetrable mystery, which corresponds to his intangible preponderance. What the leader principle really means for her is that what the leader is good at, and what Stalin and Hitler both could do, was not that they controlled the institutions of power. They didn't at the beginning. Trotsky controlled the army, right? Not Stalin. Trotsky was even more charismatic than Stalin. But what they did is they demanded loyalty, and by making everyone depend on them for their career and safety, and by constantly changing personnel, they came to be seen as winners and people who could command absolute loyalty. And so on 374, she says the supreme task of the leader is to impersonate the double function characteristic of each layer of the movement, to act as the magic defense of the movement against the outside world, and at the same time, to be the direct bridge by which the movement is connected to that world. The leader also, and this is, I think, very important, takes full responsibility for all his subordinates. If a low-level person kills someone, the leader says they were right to do so, and I take responsibility. They don't leave their people out in the lurch. They defend them, and they thus create a sense of unity and loyalty. All of this means that these totalitarian organizations, these totalitarian movements, are like secret societies in broad daylight. They're like secret societies, but they don't have a secret because they advertise their secret. But people don't believe them because of these front organization, which buffers reality from the organization and the organization from reality. She says that on 382, she says the chief value of the secret or conspiracy society's organizational structure and moral standards for purposes of mass organization is in their unsurpassed capacity to establish and safeguard the fictitious world through consistent lying. Because they protect their people from the real world, they safeguard the fictitious world through consistent lying. And that's how they work. The last form of totalitarian organization that she talks about are what she calls these elite formations, the ever more elite formations. And what these elite formations do is they're actually the people who don't believe the lies, right? They don't have to believe anti-Semitism. They don't have to believe that all bourgeois are corrupt. That's not their job. Their job is to organize. And so she writes on 384 to 385, at the bottom of 384 to the top of 385, the elite formations are distinguished from the ordinary party membership in that they do not need such demonstrations of truth of ideology, and are not even supposed to believe in the literal truth of the ideological cliches. These are fabricated to answer a quest for truth among the masses, which in its insistence on explanation and demonstration still has much in common with the normal world. The elite is not composed of ideologists, right? They're not people who are ideological, the elite. Its members' whole education is aimed at abolishing their capacity for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, between reality and fiction. The elite formations are about saying it doesn't matter if it's true or false. What matters is that it works. And she continues, their superiority consists in their ability to immediately dissolve every statement of fact into a declaration of purpose. The point is, when we say a fact, we're not actually saying a fact. We're saying that this fact works in organizing the masses to take power and form a movement. And it's their freedom, these elite people's freedom from the content of their ideologies, which is what makes them valuable to the organization. Thus, versus despots or tyrants, the totalitarian leader is free to do whatever he or she pleases. They don't actually have to follow a consistent ideology, because their elite formations will immediately turn whatever they say they're doing into an act of purpose that organizes the people. And even if the totalitarian leader would murder some of the members of their party, right? That can be turned into something that's useful for the organization. And thus they can do whatever they want, and they count on loyalty even if they murder their own members, as Stalin did. That's the organizational power that is persuasive and leads to propaganda. All right, I'm going to stop there. That's a lot. This is a rich chapter. I imagine some of you are going to want to talk about the way there is or is not analogs to some of this in the contemporary world. And that's fine. I think it's an important thing to talk about, but let's try and be as factual and as and thoughtful about that in the way we do it as we can. And I look forward to the conversation. There's two ways to participate. As you know, if you've been here before, one is through the chat function. Please do feel free to disagree with each other, but respectfully attack the ideas, not the person. And also by raising your hand under the reactions button and participating in the conversation. All right, I look forward to the conversation. James.
Okay, Roger. I walked into the hardware store this morning.
There's always a hardware store.
And the guys behind the counter said, "Oh my God, James, that haircut you got.
Oh, yeah.
Did you get a new job? You get a job?" And I said, "No, I want to be the Fuhrer. I need to change my role." This chapter, I read it 3 or 4 times. I just need the instruction manual. You identified it so clearly and so specifically. Did Hitler write an instruction manual where he lays all this out? Is this all laid out in a management course or in an instruction manual? They did mention the falsified document that was the core of the anti-Semitic writings.
Yeah.
But is there
of the Elder of Zion? Yeah.
the Elders of Zion? How did they train themselves to be able to do this so efficiently? That's
a good question, James. I mean, I don't think there's one manual. Arendt, if you look at the footnotes to this section,
which I read over and over, yep,
which are fascinating. I mean, she's reading Nazi literature, right? I mean, she's reading
really good Nazi literature I could use.
Yeah. She's reading Mein Kampf.
Mein Kampf.
Right? She's reading Himmler. And she's reading people who've studied and written about Hitler, some of whom are Nazis. She's trying to understand the way they thought and the way they worked, right? And she's reading, Stalin and similar things. She doesn't have as many sources on Stalin as she does on Hitler. She also doesn't speak Russian, so it's a little harder.
I love the discussion about how you name the organization something that doesn't quite make sense. Simple, Nazi, right? N-A-Z-I, simple. MAGA.
Yeah.
Let's go for it.
Yeah, MAGA.
I need a little slogan for my group.
Well, so I mean, it's an interesting question, right?
Okay.
First, everyone just mute yourself if you're not talking. I'm sorry, but it's an interesting question, and it's one that I think comes up a lot in these conversations, right? Let's say you think there is a totalitarian movement in a polity, and it's having some impact, and you're told by Arendt that the premise of it is that the people in it are isolated from reality, thus factual arguments are not going to work. Trying to argue and persuade them through rational facts and argumentation is not going to work. How do you respond, right? Do you try and somehow break in one level at a time into the front organizations, the fellow travelers, and bring them back to reality, right? Or do you do what James is saying? How do I create my own totalitarian movement on the other side, right? James is like, I want to be the Führer on the other side, right? And there are a lot of people who have over time argued that, the only response to this is, a different movement. I think that's a dangerous game to play, but I understand the seduction of it. But it does raise the question of how do you do this, and how do people do it? Well, the first thing is you have to have. First of all, you have to have masses, right? You have to be at a moment in which enormous numbers of people are suddenly expurgated from the stable classes, institutions, and organizations of society that had given them interest. And then you have to appeal to them as you would in a mass meeting. You have to provide them victories, feeling a sense of purpose and meaning. And that means you have to, be a kind of, you have to be willing to be a kind of demagogue, and you have to be willing to create these organizations that actively create a fictitious, coherent world. If you just say, well, they're doing it, we should do it too. I don't think at that point, one side wins or the other side wins, or what really loses is any kind of reality of plurality and common world. And so I'm a little hesitant of give me a manual for to become Führer. I understand the inclination. I'm not saying you're saying that 100%, but you're not the only one. Many people have said, fight fire with fire here. And I think that a lot of the reaction, with the idea of the resistance 6 years ago, was that let's fight fire with fire. And I don't think it worked. I think it backfired.
Yeah.
It backfires because what you do is you even further weaken reality. And the only way to resist the attack on reality, the complete fictionalization of a world and people protected from it, is to constantly strengthen reality, to strengthen plurality, not to create another fictional reality on the other side that just pushes everybody apart or pulls everybody apart.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mein Kampf.
What?
Mein Kampf.
Yeah. Let's not just go right there.
Sorry.
Greg.
Yeah, hi. You can hear me okay?
I do.
Okay. I just need a little bit of clarification, not following all the steps of the chapter. And the core of the chapter, you said, was this connection between propaganda and organization. And so could you just explain that maybe one more time so I make sure I got that? And I was also wondering what has happened to the mob in this story. We don't hear too much of them in this chapter.
Right. Good. So on the first question about propaganda and organization. So what is propaganda? Propaganda is a way of appealing to the masses and trying to bring them into your movement. And it can be through ideologies, right? In the Nazis used a number of ideologies, but race was one of them, or anti-Semitism, right? The Bolsheviks used classism, right? The bourgeoisie are corrupt and evil people, and we need to kill them or take away their property. And what Arendt says is propaganda is a way to appeal to these folks. It's not based on interest, because these are people who feel so adrift that they're actually don't care. Their primary goal is not healthcare, right? Their primary goal is feeling powerful and meaningful in the world. And so she says you have to somehow appeal to them. And while racism can sometimes be appealing and classism can sometimes be appealing, and nationalism can sometimes be appealing, and there are other ideologies as well, right? Anti-colonialism is now an ideology that is appealing to some people, or wokeism, if you're on, in certain worlds. But what she says is, in the end, not the content of these ideologies is not what really drives people forward to become adherents of a totalitarian movement. What really gets them and convinces them to be part of it is a feeling of purpose, winning, power, and that comes not through the ideology, not through the content, but through the being part of a movement. And that's what organization is. And so organization is actually part of persuasion. It's not separate from it. What really persuades people to be part of a totalitarian movement is the feeling of being organized. Does that make sense to you, Greg?
Yeah, no, it very much does. But I guess the propaganda and the ideology, however flexible they are, it still provides a language to hold people together. Right?
Absolutely.
But the language could be any language as long as people are held together.
And let me say, the conclusion of this book, right, is called Ideology and Terror. And there's no doubt that ideology is an essential part of totalitarianism. I mean, this is something Jerry and I were talking about last week. And I mean, yes, to some degree, organization and terror overcome ideology and overtake it in its importance. But I don't think you still need the fiction. What is the organization and the terror doing? It's solidifying a consistent, coherent fictional world. And that has to be based on an ideology. And so, yes, I think they go together. That's why they're two sides of the same coin, is what she's arguing here. Your other question, Greg, about the mob is an excellent question. The mob only appears, as far as I know, in the first sentence of the chapter. She says in the first sentence, only the mob and the elite can be attracted by the momentum of totalitarianism itself. The masses have to be won by propaganda. What she actually means by there, I have to tell you, is, not something I can say I 100% understand. But here's my attempt to make sense of it. The mob and the elite can sometimes be attracted to ideology. The mob is attracted by power and by victory. And thus by the momentum of totalitarianism. But the masses don't want they don't want power in the sense of control, right? Like the mob does. The mob actually wants to be in control. The masses want power in the sense of a feeling of togetherness, of purpose, of winning, in the sense of we're meaningful. And so, unlike the mob, which will actually try and take power, unlike the elite, which often have ideological commitments, the masses have to be won over by propaganda and organization, by making them feel like they are part of a coherent fictional world, and that they are a part of a coherent fictional world that's strong, powerful, winning, successful. They don't actually expect to get much benefit from it. The mob expects a benefit from it. That's, I think, the difference, if I get it right in her work. Okay?
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Jerry, always good to see you.
Thank you, Roger. I want to start out by saying that you gave a much better demonstration than I could of what I was trying to say the last session about the relative unimportance of ideology in the organization. As you yourself said, the elites in the organization simply couldn't care less about an ideology. But if you look a little bit further, Adolf Eichmann was not very far from being one of the elite of the movement, of the Nazi movement. He also wasn't an anti-Semite, according to Arendt's analysis. This, I think, I know this book is not about Eichmann, so I'll leave it there. But I want to thank you for that, as you said precisely what I was trying to say. I thought I could give a little bit of an anecdote here, and that is, I was once talking to Arendt about this very chapter, and I said to her, she liked this image very much of an onion, and you mentioned it, the outside and the inside. As you analyze totalitarianism, it's like peeling an onion. And I said to her, yeah, and the deeper you get, the more you cry. And she said, yes, Jerry, but remember, that applies only to the peeler, only to the person who's doing the peeling. I just wanted to throw that in.
That's priceless, Jerry. Thank you for that. I thought that was, yeah, I mean, I didn't actually talk about the onion as much as I should have. I realized I left it out. Jerry's talking about the image she offers of the onion as these front organizations and elite organizations that, like the onion, have more and more. And the leader is in the middle, and the plurality of societies on the outside. And each level of the onion looks both inward to keep people isolated and outward to make people think, oh, it's not as bad as you seem. And that's an important aspect. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I love that anecdote, Jerry. So thank you. And I think, yeah, I think we agree on, primarily then on terror and ideology, and their relation. So I'm glad that made sense now. Hannah.
Hi, good afternoon. I have to say, I feel so incredibly privileged to hear anything from, wait, my brain is faltering, from
Jerry
Cohn.
Yes.
That was a total thrill. It always is so great to hear. And Roger, I wanted to say very briefly to thank you for, I happened to read Amor Mundi a little bit this morning while I was looking for the Zoom link, et cetera. And your piece on settler colonialism and moral derangement was the first discussion of settler colonialism that I felt I could really use in the current. So thank you so much on that. I know it's out of line. In terms of this chapter, I wish we had at least 2 sessions on it. It's unreal, the amount of stuff that I think is getting everybody very involved, especially I certainly am. But, as somebody who's taught argument, and, I'm basically a rhetorician, so I see logic, she says at one point in this chapter, and I can't get it because in the index, it's not sending me to this chapter, but I recall her, maybe it was another chapter, but it seems like logic is the engine of the movement from my perspective. But it's like you can make syllogisms, you can make enthymemes, as long as any claims, as long as your premises are false. And, I just think that's so interesting. And then just a third comment, I couldn't help but think, and I know we don't want to talk about Trump to death, but Sidney Powell, who was one of Trump's attorneys when they were fighting the election results, and then she was sued by Dominion, the makers of the computers that she said were being controlled by South American, I forget what. Anyway, Powell's line defense of her false, absurdly false statements was reasonable people wouldn't believe her election fraud claims. And I just think that is a wonderful example of what you've been talking about in terms of, the consistency of lying and that people prefer, as Arendt said, self-respect over facts. Okay.
Thank you, Hannah. That was helpful. So on the logic question, I mean, I talked a fair bit about this idea of science and scientificity, which goes from like pages 347 to 351.
Amazing. Yeah.
And so we're going to talk a lot more about this in the 2 sessions that we devote to the last chapter, the epilogue.
Oh, excellent.
The epilogue is about this in many ways. And so we'll come back to it then. But it's an important point. And it's one that, we've touched on a couple times over the last few months as we've been reading this text. Ideology is an idea, logos, right? It's the logic of an idea. And so Arendt thinks that ideologies only emerged post 17th century, post the scientific revolution. There were no ideologies before then. Because the premise of an ideology is that it offers an absolute certain claim that will explain the world. She calls ideologies pseudoscience because there's not ever one thing that will explain the whole world. And it's not actually based in science because science doesn't make those kind of claims, but it's a pseudoscientific claim that requires you to use science, but in a kind of loose and, not very meaningful way. And so this claim that there's a kind of logical coherence to racism or to Bolshevism, to classism, or to anti-colonialism, or whatever it is, that everything can be explained by colonialism, or everything can be explained by nationalism, for her is a fake pseudo science. And that's what she means by ideology. And all ideology has this kind of logical foundation, and she'll talk more about that in the epilogue. So if that may be where you were looking and remembered it from, and if so, I encourage you to go. But we're actually going to spend 2 weeks on the epilogue, one on the epilogue that she published in this book, and one on 2 or 3 other versions of the epilogue that she gave in other areas that we'll read, as an extra credit, because I think it's worth spending time on those texts. On the Sidney Powell question, and by the way, I didn't say I don't want you to talk about Trump or wokeism or any of the other ideologies that are existing today. I'm happy to do it. I wanted to lay out my understanding of Arendt's text, and if people want to make connections, we can talk about them. I just ask people to be careful and respectful in doing so to the extent we can. But your use of Sidney Powell, I think, is right on. I mean, Sidney Powell said, I may have said this stuff, but reasonable people wouldn't believe it. And therefore I shouldn't be held responsible for it. By the way, someone could tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is also the case. Rachel Maddow was sued by someone or MSNBC and for making false claims. And the defense they gave was, we're not a news show, and anyone who thinks we're a news show is mistaken. We're an entertainment show. So it goes both ways, right?
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right to point it out. I'm not trying to say it's equal. That's not the point. I'm just trying to say that this is a widespread problem in our society, of people being so caught up inside the onion and protected from reality by so many levels that, as Arendt says, they don't even realize how dangerous what they're doing is. And, when they're actually confronted with reality, they're like, well, of course, no one could believe what I was saying is real. I just saying it. Right. But that's the kind of consistent rejection of reality that totalitarian movements demand. And, I think you're seeing it happen across the political spectrum in our society. That doesn't mean that one side's not more dangerous than the other. I think that is, but I'm just think it's there, and we have to at least be aware of it.
Absolutely.
George.
I'm going to be a little bit contrarian here as usual, but this thing about reality, I think that the onion analogy is a wonderful analogy that still persists. As far as the elites versus the masses, I mean, it's sort of quaint by now. And I think that this whole thing is that the masses do not think economically, when if power is a currency, they do think economically, or if there is such a thing as a mass anymore. You look at this Congress, for instance, and the way they vote, it's not that they don't know what's real. It's that they're doing it for their best interest, self-interest. So that's number one. Number two is something I would like to just say overall. I think that she's Arendt is a bit in her own bubble. For instance, that is, she's speaking for universal things where she's really talking about the German Jewish experience. And let's say if you happen to be, just for instance, just as an example, in the We Refugees thing, that's very touching. If you happen to be a refugee, a post-World War II refugee from Poland, she's not exactly representative of what you went through. She's somebody who's been here for most of the war, that she was transported very nicely by an American and did not suffer in the same way that most refugees, post-war refugees did. So there's always that aspect of it, is that she takes too much of herself to be a representative for the entire population of something. I'd like you to comment on that. That's all I wanted to bring up.
Thanks, George. I appreciate it. I always like provocation. So let me start with the second and then go into the first. Arendt wrote this book in the 1940s primarily. I didn't go through it because it's more scholarly than I think this requires. But this chapter in particular, she rewrote quite heavily in the 1950s. I have it marked in my book, like the new parts that she added in and the sentences changes, but most of you don't need to know that. But she added a lot. In fact, probably, at least 500, at least 1,000, like 5,000 words, I would guess, is new in the 1950s in this chapter. So, but even so, she's writing about the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century in Nazi Germany and to some extent in Soviet Russia. She's certainly not writing about, 2010 to 2024, the rise of different movements in the United States. It's just not her topic. She's not alive. And I don't think she would be very happy for us to simply say, oh, everything I say applies to court to, MAGA or wokeism or anti-colonialism or, whatever. And so I think your contrarianism is right on. In that sense, we should not be simply saying, oh, this explains what's going on today. That doesn't mean it trying to understand what happened in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and so isn't helpful in trying to think through what's happening today. It may be that what's happening today is quite different, and we have to separate them. It may be that what's happening today is has some similarities, and it might be helpful in understanding it. That brings us to the first question you ask. And you said two things that I think I want to talk about. One is that you said the masses do not think. Well, she says the masses do not think economically, and you, I think, if I understood you correctly, you challenge that. You think they do think economically. It's an interesting question. It's not clear. So who are the masses, right? Her argument is they're not a class. If you look at, and let's just take if you want, we'll take the Trump phenomena right now, as far as I understand it, right? The Trump phenomena is a mix. It's got a lot of working class people. A lot of them are white, but not all of them. There's a huge number of Latino or Hispanic working class people who are now Trump voters. There's increasingly numbers, especially of Black men who are Trump voters. A lot of them are small business owners, people with boats and things that run these armadas. They're not all poor. This is not a downtrodden class. A lot of them are. So the point I guess what I want to make is that there doesn't seem to be a unified or coherent class interest in the Trump phenomenon. It also includes many hedge fund people and other things like that. So what drives them, is an interesting question. And, people have been writing about this. I've been writing about it. Many people have been writing about it. But it has to do, I think, deeply with a sense of disempowerment, a feeling that they've lost control of the country, which could be racial, could be class-based and, anti-capitalist, for a whole host of reasons. And they want to feel powerful again. I think that one of the main attractions to the movement is this sense that Trump's a winner, right? That he never admits his error, that he's demands loyalty. And I think that there's a lot you can look at this and gain. I don't think that the driving factor of Trumpism is either a racial ideology or a class ideology. I think both are there. I'm not denying it. They're there. They're used. They're mobilized. But what's driving it is a sense that we are people who've been left out of society, who aren't, in the elite colleges or in the elite institutions. And we feel like we're on the losing end of things and we want to win. Now, you also said that Congress knows what is real and is the deal. And I think you're right. I think the people in Congress are what I would describe on pages 384 to 385 as the elite organization, the elite people in the organization that don't believe in the ideology, that don't, really think that that either the racial or the economic arguments are meaningful. What they care about and what they're good at is organizing the masses, using these ideologies in order to make them feel powerful and victorious. They have a nose for winning. That's what these people in Congress are doing. And you saw as soon as Trump lost the midterms 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, a lot of them left Trump, right? They were not committed to it. But now, as soon as looks like he's going to win again, they're back. And now over, I think almost 60% of Republicans in Congress have now endorsed Trump. A lot of these people 5 months ago would never have endorsed Trump. They're not doing it because they agree with him. They're doing it because they are organization men. They are the elite formations. And their job is to take facts and render them purposeful, not to say that they're true or false. So none of this is to say that the MAGA movement is a totalitarian movement. I'm not, I mean, I think there are totalitarian elements of it, but I also think there's totalitarian elements of things on the left, wokeism or anti-colonialism. It's to say that I think looking closely at the Trump movement, using Arendt's analysis of the importance of organization, the importance of creating a fictional coherent world, the place of ideology, the place of power and victory and winning, all of that I think is helpful in understanding the appeal, the propagandistic appeal of totalitarianism. And if you understand that, go back to James's question at the very beginning. How do you respond to it? Well, one answer is you try and mimic it on the other side, but that just weakens reality. And it allows the claim of a kind of common reality to fade further into the background. The other is that you make an effort to, reach out and talk to and engage with the outer sides, the front organizations, the sympathizers who don't fully believe. And that's going to require that you actually listen to them and change some of, your more extreme statements to welcome them into reality. That's I think the Arendtian response. But it's hard and it might take time and it's not clear it's going to win. So
Yeah.
That's how I understand it, George.
Yeah, just a couple of small comments. Number one, I agree with you completely that power is the currency. I just think it goes further than Congress. I think that a lot of people are hoping to benefit from this. I think the other thing that hasn't been mentioned is fear. And again, if you look at the European Holocaust experience, fear drives her out of this too, especially in the elites.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that next week. She talks a lot about fear in the chapter on totalitarianism and power, and so we'll talk about it. But you're right here in that clearly there's a fear amongst many in the elite, especially in the Republican Party, of being attacked by Trump, and there's a fear of many on the left being canceled or attacked by people on the left and being kicked out of being on the left. So there's no doubt that fear helps keep people in line in these movements. And I think you're absolutely right about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Who's next? Vigdis.
Yeah, I want to, I just saw at page 382, another point I think was very interesting. And that's where she says that a mixture of gullibility and cynicism had been outstanding characteristic of mob mentality before it became an everyday phenomenon of the masses. And then she says that mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. And it made me also think of, and this goes very much to what Joss just said, a journalist, a Norwegian journalist, and she interviewed one of Trump's strategists, and she wanted to know how he was so successful. And the strategist said that it's very easy. It's just to make people cheerful and fearful and know how to balance those two feelings. And if you think about it, what struck me is that if you have this kind of gullibility and cynicism that rules the people in a way where they have that attitude on a more cognitive level, and you use those two feelings, the cheerfulness and the fearfulness, and you know how to balance them and who to kind of inspire with cheerfulness and who to kind of inspire with fearfulness. That's a very dangerous mix. And when you then have artificial intelligence that was not in play back in the days, then you kind of have a quite difficult, it's reason to fear what can come of it. You have it in social media, not to mention the algorithm that kind of plays in. So people go to the social media and they go to the internet and they do the search. And because of the algorithm, they always get more of the same.
Okay, good. Thank you, Vigdis. That's really helpful. And I appreciate you making it clear that I was wrong when I said that was the only mention of the mob in the first sentence. So I appreciate being shown to be wrong. A mixture of gullibility and cynicism has been an outstanding characteristic of mob mentality before it became an everyday phenomena of masses, right? Mobs are also gullible and cynical, but in the masses, she says, in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. I think that's the extreme version of this, right? And that's what I think you see. People are able to believe the most extreme things. And then when you say to them, like, what's her name? Sidney Powell, right? Oh, how could you say that? She said, well, no one actually believes that. Nothing is true. They're able to believe the worst, and then believe that everything is a lie. And I think that is absolutely true about what's going on in this country and around the world. There's a real sense of it's all a lie, and yet I also know what's true. And then when you're confronted with it, you're like, oh, well, it's not true, but it's all a lie anyhow. And that kind of gullibility and cynicism mixed together, as you said, is a potent brew. So thank you. Dina.
Hi, I have two questions. I hope at least one of them will be somewhat provocative. The first one is about what we've discussed at the start with James's question. I wanted to push back a little on the idea of a manual or mimicry because
Say that again.
I wanted to push back a bit on the idea of a manual or mimicry because I think that might actually assume a certain scientific reproducibility or replicability that Arendt in other contexts, challenges. And so the idea that, we can read Nazi literature and then replicate it doesn't seem exactly Arendtian to me.
I don't think anyone would. I don't think the idea is that there's a manual. I was just saying she reads the literature to understand.
Manual was a shorthand for if we were to read the texts of any totalitarian movement, is that itself reproducible? Can we replicate it? Are historical movements and events replicable in the first place is the question. And then the second question is, and I apologize for the spoiler alert, but giving away the ending, but the ending of this book is, it refers to Augustine, as Arendt likes to do, and his made famous by her statement that of our natality, of our beginning. And I was wondering if you could sort of explain if there's a tension between that and this idea that we are also so much in need of predictability and consistency. Is there an inherent conflict in Arendt's view of our anthropology in us? And is that conflict universal, that we both have that need for predictability and consistency, yet our greatest capacity is that we are beginnings? And so that would go would be in tension with that other need, that we need so much certainty.
So on the second question, right? Arendt does imagine man as a beginner, as someone who can always escape fate. There is no ultimate fate because we are free, and that's the substance of the Augustine quote. She writes the human condition and thinks about this idea of human freedom as a way of thinking about, you know, how we as humans can or are free to escape the elements of totalitarianism, which are which inform our world. In the human condition, she's specifically worried about a rising sense of scientificity, automation, procedures, bureaucracy that will you know, increasingly limit human freedom. And what she says is, you know, we may end up eradicating the human condition as we've known it, but that's not fated. It's up to us to do it. And so there's a tension, as she understands it, in man, that man is on the one hand someone who can build a world, and yet in building a world, in having the freedom to build a world, he can build a world that limits our freedom. And we have to constantly negotiate that tension. And I think that's part of what she means by the human condition, that we are on the one hand free, and thus can build and artifice the world. And yet once we artifice the world, we are living in that world. How we negotiate that is a big part of what she's trying to understand. Men need both stability and freedom. The challenge, and that's what the book on revolution about, is how to create both power, freedom on the one hand, and authority and stability on the other. And that's what she's trying to do. You know, on the question of the manual, yeah, I mean, I don't mean, and I don't think she meant, and I don't think, well, I don't know what James meant. I don't think he meant it, that we want the manual. I don't think there is a manual. I think there was no manual for Hitler or for Stalin. They figured it out as they went along, and they're genius. And, you know, I don't think it's wrong to call them geniuses in some way. Their genius was to have a sense for how to build a fictional coherent world, organize it, and create the kind of loyalty that allowed that world to nourish a movement. You know, I think there are, without doubt in my mind, there are movements today that have similar qualities. I think one of the big differences between some of the movements I've talked about, like call it wokeism or anti-colonialism on the left, versus something like MAGAism on the right, is that there's no leader on the left, right? I mean, it's unclear who the leader of wokeism is or who the leader of anti-colonialism is. They're not movements that have the kind of organizational capacity on a national level that she's talking about. Whereas with MAGA, at least arguably, you know, you have a leader, and not arguably, you do have a leader, and therefore it might, you know, it has a different level of consistency. What makes Trump a great leader is not that he's following a manual. It's that he has a certain genius for organizing people, for propagandizing people who feel they need to win, and giving them a sense of coherence and community, and using ideologies to do that. The ideologies I don't think are important to him, just like I don't think they're important to the top people in the movement. They do appeal to some of the masses, and they can be useful. But he's a genius at that organizational power. And I don't think he got it from a manual. I mean, he obviously has a sense for it. stuff.
Let me just, please allow me to just clarify my first question. It wasn't about James or you or anyone. It was about whether or not movements are reproducible, replicable.
Well, I don't think they're replicable
so-
in the sense that you follow a manual, but I think clearly we live at a time in which there are masses of people. Now, at times the economy is good and people feel more stable and the masses are less swayable. But, in the wake of the financial crisis in 2009, with the rise of globalization, lots of dislocation, clearly you see around the world a lot of people who are swayable in movements. Will those movements become totalitarian? Will they take power? Those are really different questions. And I don't know the answer to those. But I think there are, I think every once in a while, a leader does emerge who's gifted and able to understand that what matters is not the content of the ideology, but the way the ideology is mobilized to create a fictional world and organize people into a unity and into a movement. And when those people emerge, that movement can be quite powerful and can be quite dangerous. And I think that's a situation we're in right now. All right, I know we're short on time, but I'm going to try and get a little more in. Bruce?
Yes. My question is a little bit different. I think it's very interesting to see how Arendt has prefigured some of the behaviors that we're seeing today. But my general question is more about the relationship in her book between creating a general theory of totalitarianism as a new kind of political form that's emerging in the modern world and so forth, and its implications and its purposes, as compared with writing about the rise of totalitarianism in the particularity of the historical events in Germany and Soviet Union, which she is also doing.
Yeah.
And they're obviously different enterprises. I was very struck by your exegesis of the sort of phenomenology of the potential people who will make up the movement, wanting a sense of belonging, wanting a sense of meaning and purpose, and so on. And if we were to sort of think through in a different cultural and social context, such as the United States, this question of how might totalitarianism arise here, I think it might give rise to the following problem. I think belonging is sort of in tension with meaning and purpose in the United States, at least, because of the emphasis in our culture on freedom and liberty and autonomy and individualism. And so my question really is, in the understanding of the phenomenon of totalitarianism that we have here from Arendt, is something like an arc built into this account of totalitarian propaganda and organization, which essentially means that any totalitarianism in any political culture and country will inherently be collectivist? Or is the possibility of a libertarian version of totalitarianism possible and open?
Thanks, Bruce. I mean, the basic premise of totalitarianism is the radical elimination of public and private freedom, right? That's how she understands totalitarianism. It's a total system in which there's no freedom left. Everybody, not only acts the same way, but even believes the same. So it would be very hard to, I don't, you may have something in mind that I'm not figuring out, but I think it would be very hard to imagine a libertarian totalitarianism. You can certainly, I mean, with libertarianism, it would be hard to imagine that we want to create everyone thinking the same and seeing the same if you're a libertarian. Maybe there's a way you could do it that I'm not thinking of, but so I will leave it at that. I'm not sure I can answer that any better. The general question about the general theory of totalitarianism versus the particulars, I will say that let's push that off till we talk about the epilogues, where that's really the theme of the epilogues. So we'll come back to it then, and we're sort of out of time now. I apologize to those who didn't get the questions answered today. I'll do my best to privilege you guys if you have questions in the coming sessions. So thank you all very much. And we meet next week on the 2nd to read Totalitarianism and Power. I will say that that's one of the most, it's really, it's harrowing. So I don't usually give trigger warnings, but there you go. It's a pretty awful, it's a pretty intense read. And I hope you read it with care and compassion in your hearts, because it's about totalitarianism and power, and the ultimate example of totalitarianism for her is the concentration camp. So you're going to get a pretty vivid account of that. So good luck. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I will see you all in a week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Gracias.
Thank you.
you.
Ciao, profe.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.